Welcome to the deep dive. We're here to unpack complex ideas, distill them down into the essentials, really, just for you.
That's right.
And today we are diving into a text that, well, many of us think we know pretty well, the Book of Job.
Hmm.
You probably picture Job as, the ultimate patient sufferer,
Yeah.
enduring everything with this quiet, pious faith.
That's the standard image, yeah.
But what if that familiar picture is really just scratching the surface? What if it's hiding something far more complex, maybe even subversive?
That's exactly what we're getting into today. Our sources suggest the Book of Job, well, the way we have it now, is actually a kind of theological battleground.
A battleground, okay.
Yeah, I mean, scholars argue it's a text that's been deliberately shaped, edited, even, you could say, silenced in parts by later editors.
Wow. Bold
So
claim.
our mission here is to try and uncover that raw, unflinching protest against divine injustice that seems to be at its core.
And then look at the editing, the layers on top.
Exactly. The layers of redaction, as it's called,
Yeah.
that tried to, well, contain that original powerful message.
Okay, so we've looked at some deep scholarly work on Job for this stuff, looking at the literary side, the history, the theology.
Right, the whole picture.
And we're going to pull out the key takeaways, the things you really need to know to understand this, well, pretty radical interpretation, and why this ancient book still matters so much.
Absolutely. Let's get into it.
So when most of us think about Job, yeah, we see that comforting story, right? Patience, a test of faith, and then, the big reward at the end. It feels kind of neat.
Very neat. Tidy.
But the sources we've looked at paint a really different picture, a scholarly view that Job is actually a theological outlier in the Hebrew Bible.
An outlier, that's a strong word.
It is. It might start with a familiar kind of story and,
Yeah.
end like a fairy tale, but the middle section, that's where it gets really complicated.
And what's really striking is the central argument from the scholarship, the beginning, those first two chapters in prose.
The setup.
And the very end, the epilogue in chapter 42. The argument is they weren't actually part of the original work.
Not original, so added later.
Added later, yes. By figures often called priestly redactors, think of them as, well, powerful religious editors back then. And these additions fundamentally changed the book's core message.
And you can really see the difference.
Oh, absolutely. The contrast is pretty dramatic. There's this stark ideological contrast, as scholars put it, between Job's poetic core, that's chapters 3 through 42, verse 6, and the comforting narrative frame wrapped around it.
Right. And in that poetic core, Job isn't just, suffering quietly. He protests.
Loudly.
He doesn't just ask questions about God's justice, he actively interrogates it. His lament is described as this unflinching protest against divine injustice.
Exactly. And connecting that to the bigger picture, that prose frame, the beginning and end, it serves a very specific function. Theological containment.
Contained, okay.
It essentially takes this really powerful, raw cry of resistance from the poetry and repackages it, makes it into a safer moral lesson.
Right, like a parable.
Yeah. Scholarship points out this restoration narrative offers a theological closure that suppresses the radical implications of Job's protest. It smooths things over.
And that's how we get Job dying, old and full of days, like the ending says. It puts everything back in order.
Precisely. It reaffirms a predictable cosmic order that the poetry itself just blew apart.
So this sounds like it's not just about, whether it's poetry or prose. It's much deeper. Ideological, you said.
Definitely ideological.
What's really at stake here for how we understand Job and maybe for us reading it today? I mean, what if this feeling that something's being suppressed? What if that's actually right?
Well, that's exactly the profound narrative contradiction that scholars point to. The book itself seems to be fighting with its own ending, in a way.
Right.
The difference between the prose and the poetry isn't just style. It's fundamentally about the ideas. One part is about order, justice, things making sense. The other is about raw, unsettling protest.
Think about the prologue, chapters 1 and 2. It sets Job up perfectly, right? Fits him into that familiar ancient framework of divine justice.
Right, the standard model.
You know the one? Good people get rewarded, bad people suffer. It introduces the Satan, this figure in the heavenly court, and the whole wager about Job's faithfulness, establishes him as perfectly righteous.
Textbook case.
But then, bam, you hit chapter 3, and the shift in tone is just jarring. It's abrupt.
Completely.
Job doesn't just complain a bit, he curses his own existence. He asks, why did I not perish at birth and die as I came from the womb? I mean, that is absolutely not the voice of a patient, pious sufferer.
Not even close.
Yep.
And throughout those poetic dialogues, Job doesn't just question his situation. He levels accusations directly at God.
Yeah.
He famously says, he crushes me with a tempest and multiplies my wounds without cause. That line just it dismantles the whole idea that divine justice is automatic or even understandable.
So in this poetic core, God isn't silent, but seems almost arbitrary, maybe even terrifying.
That's the feeling, yes. But then you get towards the end, chapter 42, and the tone shifts right back again. Suddenly, Job is restored. Double the wealth, new kids, dies peacefully. It's abrupt.
And it's fascinating that even God's big speeches, from the whirlwind in chapters 38 to 41, they never actually explain why Job suffered.
No, they don't. God offers this display of immense power. You could say power without empathy. Just overwhelms Job with the sheer scale of creation, this
Yeah.
cosmological grandeur.
And then, like you said, we snap right back to the prose in chapter 42, and everything's neatly tied up with Job's restoration.
And this dissonance, this clash, is absolutely crucial. Many scholars argue the poetic core was likely written independently, composed on its own first,
And then the frame was added.
and then later bracketed, as they
Right.
say, by these redactors using the prose, prologue, and epilogue.
Okay.
One way to think about it, which some scholars suggest, is like having an unreliable narrator.
How so?
Well, the prose frame kind of nudges the reader, guides you towards a comforting conclusion, a conclusion that the poetry itself actively resists. It's almost like a narrative override, an editorial decision imposed on a text that really fights against that kind of easy closure.
So if I'm getting this right, the Job in the poetry is seen as dangerous. He asks questions that maybe the religious authorities wouldn't want asked.
Exactly. He asks questions no priest would allow voiced.
Yeah.
He's resistant, unsettling, hard to pin down.
But the Job in the prose frame, he's the safe Job.
That's the one. He fits nicely into a world of rewards and obedience, much easier to manage.
So the scholarship suggests the restoration ending isn't really the climax of Job's journey.
No,
It's more like the erasure of his resistance.
that's a key interpretation, yes.
Mm-hmm.
It's seen as an ideological move, a way to tame a genuinely radical text and make it fit a more, shall we say, acceptable religious viewpoint.
Okay, so to really get why someone would do that, why editors would reshape the text, we need the history.
Absolutely. The historical context is critical here. We're talking about Postexilic Yehud. That's Judea after the Babylonian exile under Persian rule.
And this wasn't exactly a golden age, right?
Far from it. It was a fractured, traumatized province. The old Davidic kingdom was gone, the monarchy extinguished. There's a huge power vacuum.
And who fills that vacuum?
The priestly class. They emerge as the new leaders, the new cultural gatekeepers.
Ah, okay.
Research suggests that, likely with Persian backing, they were the ones codifying the Torah, rebuilding the temple and its theology, and basically reshaping national identity around, well, obedience to God's law.
Right, makes sense.
Scholars like David Carr point out that this priestly class essentially took over functions previously filled by monarchs and prophets. They became both the religious administrators and the architects of the national story.
So what was their agenda then? What were they trying to achieve?
Well, these priests had a very strong vested interest in promoting a theology of order, obedience, and divine justice, that things work predictably. From their perspective, theological texts weren't just about spirituality. They were vital instruments of social cohesion, moral control, and imperial stability. They needed everyone on board, following the rules, keeping things stable.
And Job, the poetic Job, he throws a massive wrench in those works.
A huge one. This figure is suffering terribly despite being righteous, who openly accuses God of injustice, who refuses the easy answers.
Yeah.
He directly challenged the foundations of their whole restored priestly system. As one scholar, Roper, puts it, the poetry of Job stands in direct tension with the ideology of reward and punishment upheld by the priesthood. Job's protest was a threat.
So the solution was edit the book.
Editorial intervention,
Yeah.
yes, add the prose framework at the beginning and the end to basically reinterpret Job's experience.
So it's not a theological crisis anymore.
Exactly. It becomes a test of faith. That's the spin. Newsom, another scholar, observes that the epilogue transforms Job from a dissenter into a model of submission. It takes the dangerous ideas in the poetry and reabsorbs them into a safe story about perseverance and getting God's approval in the end.
And the theology of that ending part, the epilogue, it lines up perfectly with the priest's goal.
Perfectly. The message is God is inscrutable, suffering is temporary, and in the end, the righteous are rewarded. This mirrored the Postexilic priestly vision: law, structure, purity, hierarchy, control.
There's that striking analogy someone used, like the redactors allowed the scream but ended it with a smile. They
Exactly.
permitted the question but answered it with silence.
hmm
It really tells you a lot about the power dynamics involved, doesn't it? And that desire to control the narrative.
It really does.
So thinking about Job himself, the character in the poetries,
Yeah.
it sounds like he's almost a kind of prophet, but a really unusual one.
That's a fascinating way to frame him. You could say Job is the prophet Israel never asked for.
Yeah.
His power isn't in predicting the future or doing miracles. It's in his refusal. His refusal to just accept that God is fair without seeing evidence or that his suffering makes any kind of sense. He becomes a prophet not of certainty but of protest.
And that makes him really different from other prophets in the Hebrew Bible, like Jeremiah or Isaiah.
Very different. They ultimately called Israel back to the covenant, back to faithfulness, reaffirming that relationship where God promised blessings for obedience.
Right.
But Job, he is not calling Israel back to faithfulness. He's questioning whether faithfulness guarantees anything at all.
Wow. Goes right back to that question from the Satan at the beginning, doesn't it?
Mhm.
Does Job fear God for nothing? Does goodness pay?
That question hangs over the entire book. It's the core tension.
And that questioning, it must have been seen as a direct threat to the whole idea of covenant theology.
Absolutely. Job's cry, he destroys both the blameless and the wicked. That just demolishes the traditional link between behavior and divine justice.
It pulls the rug out.
Completely. Scholars note that Job's refusal creates a rupture in the religious discourse of his time. A rupture, they argue, that was later sealed over by adding that prose narrative frame.
And it's interesting how Job's personal suffering could mirror what the whole community was feeling after the exile.
That's a powerful connection scholars make. Post-exilic Israel also experienced immense suffering without clear cause. Their temple destroyed, their nation broke in exile.
Just like Job, sitting in the ashes.
Exactly. Both were trying desperately to find meaning in the ruins. But while the priests were trying to rebuild stability through law and order, Job demands truth through lament, through asking the hard questions.
So the enduring power of the book, even with the editing, comes from that tension, that it's still not fully resolved.
I think so, yes. The redactors definitely tried to contain it, to smooth it over, but Job's voice, that protesting voice, it still speaks. He comes across as a man who will not lie to God to make others comfortable. He declares right, I will defend my integrity until I die. That persistence, even through the layers of editing, it still resonates.
So when you strip it all back, the book of Job isn't really about finding easy answers, is it?
Not at all. It's profoundly a story about the failure of answers and about the human cry that just keeps going anyway.
Yeah.
Our sources suggest that underneath that redacted frame, Job remains one of the most radical texts in the Hebrew Bible. It dares to imagine a world where righteousness is not rewarded, where God refuses explanation, and where suffering isn't always neatly tied to sin.
And that raises some huge questions for theology, for belief.
Absolutely foundational questions. What if the universe isn't morally balanced in the way we assume? What if God doesn't operate on our human timescale of justice? What if suffering is actually closer to chaos than some part of a tidy divine plan?
These aren't small tweaks to the system, they're foundational threats to a lot of traditional religious thinking.
They really are.
And this very contradiction in the book, the radical poetry jammed inside the containing prose. That's the genius and the tragedy of Job, as some put it.
That's a great way to phrase it. The redactors reframed the poetry. They didn't cut it out entirely,
Yeah.
but they offered a conclusion that honestly just sidesteps the deepest tensions.
Yeah.
Job never gets a straight answer. God never gives one. And the whole neat system of reward and punishment kind of collapses under the weight of Job's pain.
But maybe that's why it still speaks to people so much, that unresolved feeling.
That's exactly what many scholars argue. That theological dissonance, that clash of ideas, it invites ongoing interpretation. It keeps the text alive, dynamic. It's not a flaw. It's actually an opening.
So Job doesn't offer certainty, but maybe solidarity.
Yes, solidarity in suffering. It refuses the false comfort of bad theology, the easy answers that don't really help. It refuses institutional fear.
And it forces you, the reader, the listener, to confront this possibility that maybe real faith doesn't start with answers, but with questions, with the willingness to keep asking.
Precisely. Job essentially puts God on the witness stand. Not necessarily to condemn, but to demand engagement, to demand something.
And the God who answers from the whirlwind.
Yeah, that God is overwhelming, certainly,
Hmm.
but maybe not actually cruel. Powerful, yes, but not just in the way Job hoped.
So the revelation isn't an explanation, but something else.
Perhaps the revelation is that divinity might just be beyond comprehension, but crucially, never beyond confrontation. You can still engage, still question, still demand.
So reclaiming Job's protest isn't about rejecting faith, maybe, but reclaiming our right, our sacred right, to wrestle, to doubt, to demand more than silence.
Beautifully put. The book ultimately does not solve the problem of suffering, but maybe, just maybe, it sanctifies the one who dares to ask why.
So quite a journey through the book of Job. We've gone from, that simple story of patience to this incredibly complex, layered, redacted text.
Yeah, it's a lot deeper than it first looks.
We've seen how it reveals this profound protest against injustice, and how that protest was deliberately shaped, maybe even contained, by the historical power dynamics of its time.
Hmm.
We really hope this deep dive has given you a kind of shortcut, a way to get informed about what makes this ancient text so challenging and honestly so profound.
And maybe leaves you with a question. If the book of Job reminds us that divinity might be beyond our full understanding, but never beyond our confrontation, what's that mean for how you approach the big, unexplainable challenges in your own life?
Yeah.
What questions are you willing to keep asking, even if sometimes the only response you get is silence?